Well, good evening, everyone. Levi asked me if I would speak on servant leadership and using Nehemiah as an example. So for sake of time, we're just going to dive straight into it. So turn to Matthew chapter 25. And I want to look at a couple of verses there before we get into Nehemiah. I want to use a parable that Christ gives in Matthew 25 as some background footing for the examples that Nehemiah gives us of servant leadership. And I also want to talk about the concept that may be a little new to some of you, the idea of servant ownership. And that's why I want to use Matthew 25 as our context for the beginning. So if you turn to Matthew 25 and verses 14 and 15, this is the parable of the talents. I think most of you will be familiar with that. The three slaves are given something, and then what did they do with it? And Christ then gives a judgment on those people based on what they've done. So reading out of Matthew 25 and verses 14 and 15, "For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey." I want to look at 3 qualifying statements in those 2 verses to start with. First, Christ calls them slaves. You are a slave. If you were a believer, get over it. That's what you are. Sometimes we call ourselves servants to make ourselves feel better, but we can either be a slave to sin or we can be a slave to Christ. And here we have slaves. And the Bible also says that he called his own slaves. That is, those that belong to him. In the case of the modern day believer, we're talking about Christians. We're not talking about others that tag along or follow along or maybe get drawn in without a true relationship with Christ. And then we have a second thing in that he entrusted his possessions and went away. And that's very important for what we're going to talk about tonight with Nehemiah. This wasn't somebody that handed something over and then watched them play with it. This wasn't you give something to your kids and then you help nurture this gift through your children. Christ says that the master gave the slaves the talents and then went away. And that's key here because he gives these slaves full authority and full ownership of what he's given. And that's where the problem comes in for the third slave in particular. We'll get to that a little later. But then he's out of sight or control of either the slaves or the assets that he's given. He has given them entirely over to them. He's given them full authority and possession. And then in 15, the second half of the verse, it says that he gave each according to their ability. When God gives us something to do, our ability to do it or not do it is not a surprise to him. Our follow-through with the task we're given is the testimony that we give of him. And we'll cover that a little bit more as we go along. So I wanted to cover those 3 things out of Matthew 25. He called his own slaves, he entrusted them with the possessions and went away, and then he gave each according to his own ability. So with that said, let's bounce over to Nehemiah and look at the examples of that we have with the idea of servant, not just leadership, but servant ownership. And that's the key I want to get out of Matthew 25 as we apply it. Nehemiah was given a task. He was given a calling, he was given tools to work with, and he was given a situation to deal with. And in that, Nehemiah doesn't just take possession of the situation, he takes ownership of that situation. The results of how it goes are going to come down fully on his shoulders. The rewards of what he does are going to come down on his shoulders. And the situations that have to be dealt with are going to come down on his shoulders. Like the talents that are given to the slaves, they have full possession and ownership of them, and then we see what they did with them. In the story of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is what we would call a layman. Ezra and Nehemiah go together. Traditionally, they were the same book, but in the Bible that we have today, we've divided them up in 2 because they kind of tell 2 separate stories from 2 perspectives, but they are 2 stories that are very much conjoined. We've got the return of the Israelites back to the traditional Holy Land after the 70-year captivity, and in Ezra goes back and sees to the rebuilding of the temple. And then about 60-odd years later, we have the rebuilding of the walls by Nehemiah. And we've got to look at three positions involved here. First, in Jerusalem, we had Zerubbabel, who was the prince. He was the politician in what was going on in Nehemiah's time. We have Ezra, yes, that Ezra, Mary Helen, who was the priest. And he is seeing to the spiritual position of the people that are in Jerusalem during this 60, 70-year period prior to the walls being built. And then we have Nehemiah. Nehemiah, as I said, is a layman. He doesn't have an official position spiritually. He has a relationship with God, but not a called out position among the people necessarily. But he's there to do a commission that he was given by God. So first, let's look at the calling. Chapter 1 and verse 3, we have the introduction to the work and the need that was required by God of Nehemiah. The temple had been built, but the city walls had fallen, and the people were out of God's favor, verse 6 says. We find that the temple had been built, the people had a place to worship, but they were still being interfered with by the neighboring nations around them. And while they had originally, during the time of the building of the temple, turned their hearts to God, now we're a generation later, and as traditional with the Israelites, they've chosen to adopt the practices and religions of the neighbors around them. And so the people are out of favor with God in chapter 1 and verse 6 in Nehemiah. In verse 11 of chapter 1 and in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, Nehemiah sees his place and his responsibility in a solution. And in Nehemiah 2, he prays to God to let him be part of the solution and an open door for the work. It's interesting that Nehemiah, in the beginning of the book, takes on some of the position of a priest. He takes ownership in his prayer of what the Israelites have been doing over this time. He uses the term "we" in the prayer. We have denied God in this area, and we have turned our back in others. And so Nehemiah is not just walking into the situation and making observation of it. Nehemiah is taking ownership of what's happened. He's making the responsibility personal. And that's a key element for how we as believers should be dealing with the tasks that God gives us in our life, in our ministries that we practice. It's not enough in most cases that we just get told, yes, we're the Sunday school teacher, great. Or yes, we're given this job to do, that's great. And we go in and we do it as it's convenient or comfortable or just to the extent the last person may have done. When God gives us something to do, He gives us the abilities, the calling, and He expects us to be emotionally involved in it, and not emotionally in a bad way, but He expects us to take ownership, if you will, of this thing that He's called us to do, whatever that is, so that we're doing it then not from the position of something that doesn't really matter to us, or it's off to the side, or we can put some part-time to it. God gives us a ministry with the expectation that we're going to wholeheartedly do it. And that goes back to the idea of ownership of that issue. So in chapter 2, Nehemiah prays that he can be part of the solution, that God will open the door for the work, and that the king would show compassion on Nehemiah to let Nehemiah accomplish what he desires to do. Remember, Nehemiah at this time, he's the cupbearer to the king. So he has an interesting point of access, but he has no authority. And so asking that God would make the king compassionate on Nehemiah such that Nehemiah could go do the work he felt called to do was a big step. He didn't really have any leverage in it. It was just an ask, but it was an ask spurred on by his calling by God to do this work. So he asked the king for permission and resources to fulfill the goal. So he took ownership of the situation. If we read the recorded prayers for both himself and the people of Israel, they show that Nehemiah takes acceptance of responsibility for what has happened and for what action is required. Nehemiah recognizes he is in a position to make a change, and today we might call that, to use a nice spiritual word, that we're spiritually gifted. And each of us do, as believers, have gifts bestowed upon us by God for the work that He expects us to do. If we take those gifts to ourselves and we think that we've been given the gift for our own edification or for our own pleasure, we're forgetting that we've been given the gift to serve. We need to take what God's given. Matthew 25 gives us the parable. They're given talents. I find that interesting. Talents and talons, money and time. We've been given this asset to work with. And what do the first two slaves do with it? The first two go out and take complete ownership, not just possession, but ownership of it, and put it to work for their master. The third one, and again, you guys are all familiar with this, takes possession of what he's been given, buries it into the ground, and later when the master comes, he is scolded and condemned for not taking ownership of what he's been given. He takes possession and buries it in a hole. Nehemiah has taken possession of a situation and now takes ownership of it. He's personally going to get involved and personally put his whole self into the work. We've been given these gifts so that we can edify each other, so that we can edify the church, so that we can glorify God. Those are the reasons we've been given the spiritual gifts we have. Those are the reasons that Nehemiah saw for what he was able to do or what he felt called to do in the situation he was in. If we can gain some personal edification and some peace and happiness out of what God has given us as a gift, all the better. But remember, the core reason we've been given a gift is so that we may apply it to the callings that God gives us as we go through our spiritual walk. The next thing we see is that Nehemiah was entrusted. As we showed earlier, Nehemiah was a layman. He wasn't a priest. Ezra was doing that. Nehemiah had a personal relationship with God, and he was exercising it faithfully. But the priestly duties were not part of his purview in this situation, at least in the first half, a little bit in the second half of the book, but not so much in the first half. The priestly work was being handled by Ezra. He was not a politician. Zerubbabel represented the ruling class in this issue. Yes, as I said earlier, Nehemiah had a connection to the political situation through his job as a cupbearer. But being the cupbearer did not give you political leverage in the situation. It just made you a known face in the organization. Nehemiah exercises that issue of being known by the king and speaks to the king in a very narrow and defined way in order that he might try to fulfill the commission that he believes God's given him. So God gives Nehemiah an opportunity and a skill set for the purpose that he has then put before Nehemiah, the commissioning that God has given Nehemiah. A few pages over in your Bible, you'll see where Mordecai tells Esther that Esther has attained royalty for such a time as this. And I find that a very pivotal point in the book, at least the way I read the book of Esther, that Esther sees what's going on, she has a position, but she doesn't really know what to do with it. Mordecai says, perhaps you've attained royalty for such a time as this. And suddenly it becomes clear to Esther that she has to take ownership of what's going on. The fact that she is a Jew, that Naaman wants to kill her among all the other Jews, and the fact that just because she's the queen isn't going to save her. And that is Mordecai's purpose for that statement. Such a time as this. Mordecai recognizes that Esther is in a position to make a change if she will take ownership of where she's at. In the parable of the talents, the master gives the slaves the resource according to their abilities. And it's the same with Esther, it's the same with Nehemiah, and it's the same with us. We are given that we may serve. And be that financial or time or talent or opportunity, however it presents itself, we are to take that opportunity that we see with the gifts we've been given, and what I'm trying to say here, take ownership of that. Ownership not in an exclusionary way. We're not kicking people out. Ownership in a way that we take responsibility in God's perspective for what we've been given and how to apply it. So we see that Nehemiah takes ownership. In the parable of the talents, as we've talked about, each slave is given something, and from the text it is clear that the talents are given wholly into their charge as slaves. and that the slaves will be held accountable. And this demonstrates the distinction between ownership and possession. So Nehemiah was given a distinct position to serve and took ownership of the scenario. So let's look at some examples. In Nehemiah 1:11, he was the cupbearer to the king, and he had opportunity for face-to-face appeal for service. And in 2:1 through 5, he puts the gifting of position to work towards the service to God. He's taking ownership of the fact that he has this position. It's not just, I'm going to sit here knowing what I could be doing. He's going to dive in with both feet and do it. In verses 7 to 8 of chapter 2, in that conversation with the king, he has kind of a, as long as I'm here moment. See, he's going to deliver the cup into the hand of the king, and he says a very quick prayer. We don't know what it is, but we know that in that moment he prays. And he tells the king, my country, my home city is in ruin. My people have gone back and are in disarray. The temple is there, but I feel called to do something about the walls. That's R.C.'s paraphrase. And the king says, yes. And then Nehemiah says, as long as I'm here, I could use a letter of safe passage, because I'm going through dangerous territory, and we're going to need material, particularly lumber, to build this wall and reinforce it and build the gates and the houses. Can I get that? And the king, in his good nature towards Nehemiah, gives it to him. Because, as we see in the verse 8, the good hand of my God was upon me. God is not going to put us in a position to do something and then let us fall on our face when he's commissioned us to do it. The success of the issue is in God's hands, but the glory goes to God. And Nehemiah says, the good hand of my God was upon me. If that's as far as this whole thing had gotten with Nehemiah, Nehemiah had still followed what God had him to do, and God was glorified through what the king had asked or had allowed. But then it moves on. In chapter 2, verses 11 through 18, he assembles others for the work. Some of the callings that we have are one-person jobs. Some of the callings that we have require the help of others. This ownership idea can include fellow workers, particularly from a functional standpoint, but more importantly, from a relational between each other and with God standpoint. So we find this idea of, today we would use the phrase fellow workman. If you want to read a book about fellow workmen, read the book of Philemon. Philemon is a story written by Paul about two other fellow workmen that he's working with. And if you read that, it takes you all of 5 minutes. You see that the glory goes to God for the change of heart of all three of the men involved. That fellow workman idea. When we're doing a job that God calls us to do, we need to be bringing people in as needed to work with us, because that's part of the resource that God gives us as fellow believers. Ownership doesn't mean exclusion. It does mean responsibility, but it doesn't mean you have to do it alone, or that you're allowed to dismiss or ignore others that are trying to work with you, or that are called to work with you. And that was the desired result that Nehemiah had, was to bring others in to help with the work. In chapter 4, we see that the work was attacked from the outside. There were neighboring rulers and kingdoms that were upset about the progress that Nehemiah was making in building the wall. Building the temple under Ezra was questionable to the neighbors, but it kind of was allowed to happen without a whole lot of resistance. Building the walls is a different issue. If you want to worship your God in a pagan culture, they could kind of tolerate that. If you want to build a city and be defensible and known as a separate people from the people around you, that's a whole other issue. And the work was therefore, that Nehemiah was doing, was therefore rebutted against by the neighboring areas. They tried to scare him and intimidate him. And Nehemiah's reaction was that he took offense on behalf of all the workers, and he prayed. It's interesting, this idea of him taking offense on behalf of all the other workers. We tend to see offense as a bad thing. And offense kind of falls in that same file cabinet as anger. It's not always a bad thing. but it is something that you don't play with recklessly. Nehemiah was upset at how things were being treated by the outside people. He knew God had commissioned him to do this job. He took ownership of seeing that it was going to be done. And one of the things that came against him was these people working or trying to scare and intimidate him. And so in verse 5 of chapter 4, Nehemiah makes an interesting prayer. He says, "Do not forgive them." Nehemiah is praying to God about these people that are working against Nehemiah from the outside. And he says, "Do not forgive them, for they have demoralized the builders." The idea of praying that prayer is scary to me and brings up a whole sermon on itself. But the fact that Nehemiah was so wholly invested into what was going on that he was seeing it from God's perspective and from God's judgment, and from God being looked down on and taken advantage of by the people around him, not just himself and the workers. And so the response that God has available is whether to forgive or not. And Nehemiah prays, "Don't forgive them." That's a very strong response to have on Nehemiah's part, but it demonstrates to me, and what I'm trying to relay to you, the depth of ownership that he's taken for this. Nehemiah understands that he's going to be responsible for what he prays, and he's asking God to see that these people that are working against him are held responsible in that same arena as well. In chapter 5 of Nehemiah, we see demoralization from the inside. So the Jews are all working, trying to build the wall. And the Jewish nobles have been selling the goods and materials and food that the workers need at extortionary values to the workers, so that the rulers and these are Jews, the Jewish rulers are getting rich, and the Jewish people that are doing the work are becoming slaves to their own Jewish brothers. And Nehemiah calls them out in verse 6 through 8 of chapter 5 for the fact that the Israelite nobles are putting their fellow Israelite workers into slavery. Nehemiah is using his own resources to buy the Israelite workers out of slavery by paying the debts to the rulers, and then the rulers are putting the people right back into slavery. And Nehemiah calls them on the carpet on this. We have 3 examples in that position. We see where Nehemiah is using his own funds to end the slavery of the Jews in verse 8. We have the confrontation with the nobles on the Israelites' behalf in verse 7. I know I went back there. And then he provided for the work to the best of his ability in verses 14 through 18. If you sit down and look at the table Nehemiah was setting every week, I believe it's every week or month, in verses 14 through 18, that is many tons of food. And from the text, we see that Nehemiah is paying for that out of his own pocket. I'm not saying that every job you do on behalf of God or for the church has to be paid for out of your own pocket. I am saying that we should be that invested in what we're doing. We should be taking ownership not just of the physical work, not just of the convenience or the glory or the commission, but it is going to cost. The full reward for us as believers in whatever this costs is eternity with God. And Paul makes it clear in the New Testament that everything that we suffer pales to that. But day to day, there will be cost in what we do for God. And it may not be a big cost, but the fact that maybe you got to run to Lowe's and buy some materials for something that the church needs done, and you decide you're going to pay for it out of your own pocket. Great. Or maybe Levi says, I can reimburse you. Great. Don't let the money be the hang-up in this conversation. It's the willingness and the ability to use what you've been given or given access to wholly to God's glory in what you're trying to do. And that is a major part of ownership. You're willing to see it from that perspective and take responsibility for what's going on. And then we see also in verse 18 and 19 of chapter 5 of Nehemiah that the servitude was heavy on the people. refers back to the fact that Nehemiah, in taking ownership of this, took ownership for the emotional plight of the people and what was going on. He recognized how the people were suffering, and we see in how he deals with them, with the people feeling threatened physically and feeling threatened emotionally, Nehemiah finds responses and answers to that. And in his humility, he makes another interesting prayer towards the end of this section of the book. He says, "Remember me," to God. I don't see Nehemiah saying that out of desperation. I don't see him saying it out of destitution. I don't see him saying it out of self-pity. Nehemiah realizes that the reason he has so heavily invested himself physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially into this endeavor that God gave him is because, one, God gave it to him, and his heart's desire is to meet the demand that God has put before him. And so he says, "Remember me." It's not a whine. Nehemiah is not whining because he's worried God's going to forget. Nehemiah is kind of putting it into perspective for himself. He's asking God to remember the fact that he has done this to the best of his ability. Not that God would forget, but sometimes we pray so that we remember. And it puts us in a proper perspective, or reminds us of the proper perspective we should have before God. And asking that God remember what he has done, what Nehemiah has done in this case, is kind of helping Nehemiah contextualize what he's done and the scope that he's put to it. It's not a personal issue. It's a fact that he took ownership of the situation, and God is to get the benefit of this issue that this work that Nehemiah has done. It's clear that God put Nehemiah in a particular position, in a particular time, for a particular goal. And God will do that for us as individuals from time to time. Not all of our callings may be so dramatic. I have built some walls, I've never built a city. Each of our callings will be, though, important to God, regardless of how small they may seem from an outside perspective. All the different things we get called to do as believers for the edification of the church, for the edification of each other, for the glory of God. Taking ownership of what we are called to do, be it a 5-talent issue, a 2-talent issue, or a 1-talent job, will yield the results that God desires and the rewards that God promises. And that's all I have for you tonight.